The arrest. John Hargrove's hands were covered in grease and oil as he worked methodically at his old workbench. The hum of the small workshop, tucked away on the fringes of a colony barely noticed by the Empire, was familiar and comforting. Outside, the stars twinkled faintly through the dusty windows, but inside, it was just John, his tools, and the quiet rhythm of a life he'd built in retirement. He was no longer a man of great adventure or grand accomplishments. To most, John was just an elderly mechanic, his once dominant frame now withered by age, his movements slow and deliberate. He'd spent years fixing starships and machinery for travelers, for miners, and for anyone passing through the colony. The work was simple, honest, and his only company was the occasional visitor in need of a repair. But today was different. The sharp crackle of a transmission interrupted the quiet, followed by the unmistakable thrum of a fleet descending from the skies. John's weathered face tightened as he glanced up at the cracked ceiling of his shop. He knew what was coming. He'd heard the rumors. The Galactic Empire had begun expanding its reach into the outer sectors, and the fringe worlds were starting to feel their presence. The unmistakable hum of Imperial ships filled the air, louder now, closer. It wasn't just a single craft. There were dozens, massive warships carrying thousands of soldiers. Imperial forces had come to the colony, and that meant trouble for anyone who stood in their way. John knew that if the Empire was here, it was because they were looking for someone, and it was too much of a coincidence that they'd arrived just as his name surfaced on the Empire's radar. John wiped his hands on a rag, setting his tools aside, and moved toward the back of his workshop, where a hidden compartment held something he'd hoped never to need again. His fingers brushed over the smooth surface of an old star map, a relic from the days when the galaxy was in the midst of war, a time when he was someone else entirely. His heart raced, but his hands remained steady. There was no point in running. He knew they'd find him. Outside, the ground shook with the weight of Imperial boots. The sound of heavy footsteps approached his door, followed by the harsh bark of commands. "This is the Galactic Empire. Open the door." John didn't flinch. Instead, he walked toward the door, his legs stiff but resolute. The door slid open, revealing a dozen stormtroopers, weapons raised. At their head stood an officer, young and arrogant, his uniform pristine, his face an unreadable mask of authority. "John Hargrove." The officer's voice was clipped cold. John didn't answer immediately. He simply studied the officer. The man was far too young to be a seasoned warrior, no doubt a recent graduate of the Imperial Academy, eager to prove himself. It was the arrogance of youth that led to the downfall of many. "I'm John Hargrove," he said finally, his voice steady, "and you're in the wrong place." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You're under arrest for suspicion of aiding and abetting anti-Empire insurgents. Come with us." He made a motion, and two stormtroopers advanced. John didn't move. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm not going anywhere with you." The officer smiled thinly. "We don't need your cooperation." He snapped his fingers, and the stormtroopers surged forward. John didn't resist. There was no use in it. The officer's movements were quick and practiced, but what they didn't understand was that he didn't need to fight them. His mind had long since shifted from the body's limitations. Before they could grab him, he spoke calmly, almost disinterested. "I suggest you reconsider. I have nothing to do with whatever it is you're chasing." The officer's eyes flickered with suspicion, but he gave the signal, and the soldiers lunged at John. One of them reached out to grab his arm, but before he could make contact, John shifted his weight just enough to send the soldier stumbling. A single move, almost imperceptible, knocked the soldier off balance, and the man barely managed to catch himself. "What the hell?" The officer was cut off by a sudden command. He glanced at a tactical screen on his wrist, where a red light blinked frantically. "Commander Thrax," one of the stormtroopers called out, "we've located several encrypted data files in the workshop." The officer's face twisted with frustration, but it wasn't from the failed attempt to arrest John. It was the discovery of something far more troubling. "What data?" he demanded, moving toward the soldier. "Some old star charts, some weaponry, stuff that doesn't belong here." John's face didn't change. "I told you, I'm just a mechanic. Whatever you think you've found doesn't concern me. Commander Thrax's eyes flicked to John, considering him for a long moment. I don't believe you. John tilted his head slightly. It's not about belief, is it? You come to make me a suspect in whatever you're chasing, but you'll find nothing of interest here. Your efforts are better spent elsewhere. Thrax's expression hardened. He motioned for the soldiers to continue their search of the workshop, but his eyes never left John. Don't think for a second that we'll let you off that easily, Hargrove. You'll come with us. We'll find out who you really are. John's mind raced briefly through his history, the wars he'd fought, the lives he'd taken, the countless moments he'd buried deep. He'd erased all trace of his former self, or so he thought. The galaxy was far bigger than it seemed, and the Empire's reach far more insidious. Do what you must, John said, his voice calm. But I promise you one thing. You'll regret it. Commander Thrax gave a short, mirthless laugh. We'll see about that, old man. The stormtroopers seized him, and John was led away. But even as he was escorted from his workshop, his mind was already working, planning. He had no intention of letting them uncover the true nature of who he was, but the Empire had made a grave mistake in choosing him as their prisoner. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The investigation. The sterile, cold walls of the Imperial holding cell were an immediate contrast to the familiar, cluttered chaos of John Hargrove's workshop. His back ached from the uncomfortable metal chair, but he paid it no mind. Tom had long since ceased to be a concern for him. He had waited far longer than this for things to unfold. His body may have been frail, but his mind was sharp, still capable of long periods of patience. He had been detained for hours now, maybe longer, as Commander Thrax's men moved him through a series of interrogation rooms, all of which felt equally claustrophobic and soulless. They had yet to break him, despite their forceful tactics. The door slid open, and the scent of synthetic air wafted in as a new figure entered, Lieutenant Vastra. She was younger than Thrax, with sharp, calculating eyes and an air of quiet professionalism. She had a reputation as a thorough investigator, one who could extract even the most stubborn secrets. But something about John's presence unsettled her. The stormtrooper guarding the door stepped aside, allowing Vastra to enter. Her boots clicked on the hard floor as she approached John, sitting down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. John studied her, the wrinkles around her eyes betraying an underlying tension. She had the bearing of someone who had seen her fair share of brutality, but there was something else behind her eyes, something more complex. I'm Lieutenant Vastra, she said, her voice measured. I'm going to ask you some questions, Hargrove. I'd prefer it if you cooperate. John met her gaze without flinching. I'm not your enemy, Lieutenant. I'm just an old man who fixes starships. Her lips tightened slightly. She hadn't expected him to make it so easy. No defiance, no resistance. Just that unsettling calm that seemed to unnerve everyone around him. The reports we've gathered say otherwise, she said. You've been seen in areas that are far beyond your supposed capacity. Some of the data we recovered from your shop suggests you have knowledge of military tactics, advanced weaponry, and star charts that belong to long-dead fleets. You were involved in the early days of the Galactic Rebellion, weren't you? John's brow furrowed. She had done her homework, that much was clear. But she was wrong in some respects. She was asking questions that he had long buried, about a past he had hoped was forgotten. I was a mechanic, he said evenly, though there was a flicker of something old in his eyes. I helped when I could, but I'm not who you think I am. Vastra's fingers drummed lightly on the table, her eyes narrowing. She leaned forward, her voice soft but persistent. You don't get to decide who you are now, Hargrove. The Empire is not interested in your excuses. You've been hiding something for years. Why? What were you really involved in? John didn't immediately answer. Instead, his mind wandered back to the rebellion days, the early days of fierce resistance. He had been a leader, a strategist, someone far more than just a lowly mechanic. The galaxy had been a different place then, ruthless, chaotic, and dangerous. The Imperial forces were just beginning to take shape, their oppressive grip tightening. He had been a part of something much bigger than himself. But that was a lifetime ago, and he had made sure to bury every trace of that life. Until now, you have no idea what you're dealing with, John said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of countless experiences. The Empire has a habit of believing it controls everything, but it doesn't. You don't understand what true power is. Vastra studied him for a long moment. He didn't flinch under her scrutiny, his steady gaze unnerving her more than she would admit. She glanced at the datapad in front of her, where she had reviewed his history, every bit of evidence she could find. There were inconsistencies, gaps, and holes in the record. And the more she read, the more questions she had. John Hargrove wasn't just some random mechanic. He was someone the Empire had tried to erase. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice softening. "Why disappear? Why leave it all behind?" John's eyes clouded for a brief moment, the past flickering behind them. "Sometimes, it's better to disappear than to continue fighting. The war changed everything. The people I cared about, the ones who trusted me. I couldn't watch it destroy them." The raw emotion in his voice caught Vastra off guard. She wasn't used to hearing such vulnerability, especially not from someone who was supposedly just a mechanic. But the story didn't add up. If he had truly been a part of the rebellion, why hadn't anyone mentioned him? Why wasn't there any record of his death? Her fingers tapped on the datapad again, this time bringing up a file that made her pause. It was a set of encrypted star charts, dated to a time when John should have been considered dead. The coordinates they pointed to were near the border of Imperial space, an area filled with relics from the old wars, now controlled by powerful factions that had nothing to do with the Empire. "Where do these coordinates lead?" Vastra asked, showing him the screen. "What are you hiding, Hargrove?" John leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the screen. The corners of his mouth twitched upward, but it wasn't a smile, more a recognition of something he couldn't ignore. "I didn't hide it," he said softly. "The galaxy's bigger than you think, Lieutenant, and your Empire hasn't even begun to understand what's coming." Vastra's gaze didn't leave him as she processed his words. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they didn't make sense. The man sitting in front of her had the knowledge, the experience, the authority of someone who had been at the center of something far greater than just an old rebellion. He was a relic, one the Empire had forgotten, but one they now couldn't ignore. "I don't know who you think I am, Hargrove," she said, her voice steady, "but I'll find out." John leaned back in his chair, a quiet confidence emanating from him. "You'll regret it when you do," he said, his voice low. "The Empire always does." Vastra's eyes narrowed. The stakes were higher than she realized, and she was beginning to understand that she had no idea what kind of can of worms she had just opened. The awakening. The clang of boots on metal echoed down the sterile hallways of the Imperial prison. Lieutenant Vastra's footsteps were deliberate, each one punctuating her growing unease. She was no longer just a bystander in this investigation. Every piece of information about John Hargrove seemed to paint a different picture of the man, one that defied everything the Empire had taught her to believe. Vastra had been assigned to interrogate Hargrove, but now it felt more like she was the one being tested. What she had once believed was a simple case of a criminal hiding among the rebels had turned into a tangled web of military secrets and forgotten history. Each word Hargrove spoke, every look he gave, peeled away another layer of what she thought she knew. The more she uncovered, the more she was forced to reconsider the role of the Empire in shaping the galaxy's history. As she approached the holding cell, the two stormtroopers standing guard straightened, recognizing her. The door slid open without a sound, revealing John sitting calmly at the table, his hands folded in front of him. His eyes followed her every movement, as though he had been waiting for her. "Vastra," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "You're not here to interrogate me anymore, are you?" She hesitated before entering, the heavy door closing behind her with a quiet hiss. "No," she admitted. "I'm not." John's face remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper understanding. "You're wondering what all this means, aren't you? Why I'm still alive, why you're here, why the Empire's records are full of lies. You're beginning to see what I've known all along." Vastra didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure she could. She had come to this cell with one purpose, to extract information from him. But now, she felt something else stir inside her. A sense of fear, yes, but also curiosity. What was Hargrove hiding? Who had he really been? She took a breath, then slid into the chair opposite him, folding her arms. "Tell me who you are," she said, her voice tight with restraint. "Tell me everything." John leaned back in his chair, looking at her with an almost sad expression. "You've got it all backwards. You're asking the wrong questions." Vastra frowned. "Then what questions should I be asking?" "The ones you've been avoiding," he replied. His voice softened as he spoke, but the authority in his words was unmistakable. "The ones that make you doubt everything you've ever believed about the Empire, about the galaxy, about yourself." She wanted to argue, to shut him down, but something in his eyes made her pause. What was it about this man? His calm, unwavering demeanor, the way he spoke as though he'd seen and survived things she couldn't even imagine. There was something familiar about the way he held himself, as though he'd lived 100 lives before the one he was in now. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" Vastra asked before she could stop herself. John chuckled quietly. "I was trained in a lot of ways, on the battlefield at the heart of the rebellion, by people who had their own reasons for fighting. But you wouldn't understand. Not yet." Her chest tightened as his words struck a chord deep within her. It was as though he was challenging her, forcing her to confront something that had been gnawing at the back of her mind since she'd first encountered him. With everything she'd been taught, everything she'd been conditioned to believe was a lie. Vastra stood abruptly. "Enough with the games. If you won't tell me your story, then tell me about the attack on the Imperial outposts." John's eyes remained fixed on her, unwavering. "I didn't plan those attacks. But I can tell you this, whoever did knows exactly how the Empire operates. They've learned its weaknesses. They've studied it. They know what it takes to hit you where it hurts. And soon, they'll show you just how fragile your empire really is." Vastra's stomach churned. "So, you're saying you know who's behind these attacks?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. John's lips curved into a slight smile. "No, but I have an idea. You're looking in the wrong places, Lieutenant. You're focusing on the wrong people. The ones behind these attacks aren't hiding in the shadows. They've been waiting for you to notice." He stood, slowly, and for the first time, Vastra noticed the ease with which he moved, like a predator preparing to strike. The man she had underestimated for days was no helpless old mechanic. He was something far more dangerous. "You need to understand something, Vastra," he said, his voice low and commanding. "The rebellion didn't end when you thought it did. It just went underground. And when it resurfaces, it will be more than the Empire can handle." A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized what he was saying. The rebellion, the real rebellion, hadn't died. It had merely been waiting for the right moment to rise again. Vastra turned on her heel and stormed out of the cell, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? She had thought the Empire was invincible. But now, after her encounter with Hargrove, she wasn't so sure. He had planted seeds of doubt, and they were taking root. As she left the prison block, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something massive, something far bigger than she could understand. Her entire world, everything she'd known, was shifting before her eyes. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that John Hargrove might just be the catalyst for the change. The Empire had made a grave mistake in underestimating him. And now, it might be too late to stop what was coming. The Empire's shadows. The following days were a blur for Lieutenant Vastra. She tried to focus on her duties, to return to the cold, logical world she had always trusted, but the nagging doubts that John Hargrove had planted in her mind refused to go away. She found herself replaying their conversations over and over, analyzing every word, every movement. Something about his presence, his calm, almost otherworldly confidence, stayed with her. Vastra had seen many prisoners in her time with the Empire, but none like him. Most would crack under interrogation, revealing their secrets in a matter of hours. But Hargrove, he was different. There was a depth to him, a knowledge of things the Empire hadn't thought worth investigating. And every time she looked at him, she felt that old, instinctive fear rise within her. The same kind of fear she'd felt in the presence of soldiers who had survived battles no one had spoken of, warriors whose names were erased from history. She stood in her office, staring at the screen in front of her, The encrypted file she had accessed from Hargrove's workshop still open. The coordinates, the star maps, and most unsettling of all, the cryptic messages hidden in the data. Every file led to dead ends or areas of interest that seemed unimportant until one considered the broader scope of history. The files weren't just random old tech or forgotten relics. They were connected. They led to the heart of the galaxy's deepest secrets. And John Hargrove was at the center of them all. There was a knock at the door. She glanced up to see Commander Thrax standing in the doorway, his face as stern as ever. His eyes narrowed as he took in the screen she was working on. "Vastra," he said in his usual cold tone. "I need an update on the prisoner. We're running out of time." Vastra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned off the screen and stood, meeting Thrax's gaze. "I've been reviewing his case," she said carefully. "There's more to Hargrove than we thought." Thrax's lips curled into a tight smile. "You've been swayed by his games, Lieutenant. He's a relic from an old rebellion, nothing more. He's stalling, trying to buy himself time. Our mission is to find out who he's really working with, and then we'll be rid of him." But Vastra wasn't so sure. "I don't think it's that simple. Hargrove, he's been involved in things, big things, things that could change everything." Thrax's eyes flashed with irritation. "You're letting this man get inside your head. He's dangerous because he's clever, not because he's some kind of galactic legend. He was a rebel. We crushed the rebellion. It's over. But what if it isn't?" Vastra pressed, taking a step toward him. "What if we've missed something? What if the rebellion has always been here, right under our noses, waiting to resurface?" Thrax stiffened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a firm resolve. "We've been hunting for remnants of the old rebellion for years, Vastra. They're gone. Hargrove is just a man, an old man, living in the past. He's not the threat." Vastra didn't respond immediately. She had seen enough to know that there was more at play here than anyone in the Empire could possibly imagine. She had a gut feeling that Hargrove's knowledge, his experience, could hold the key to something far greater than just the rebellion. And if she ignored it, she would be making the same mistake every other officer in the Empire had made when they underestimated their enemies. She turned to face the window, staring out at the stars beyond the station. "What if the Empire isn't as invincible as we think?" she muttered, more to herself than to Thrax. Thrax's voice cut through her thoughts. "The Empire is eternal. You do well to remember that, Lieutenant." Hours later, Vastra found herself once again standing outside Hargrove's cell. The guards nodded at her as she entered, the heavy door sliding open with a low hiss. John was seated at the same table, his hands folded in front of him, the same patient expression on his face as if he had been waiting for her all along. "You've been thinking," he said, his voice calm but knowing. "You're starting to see the bigger picture." Vastra didn't sit. Instead, she paced in front of the cell, her mind racing. "You're not just some old man who hid away, are you? You've been part of something much bigger than I could have imagined. The Empire thinks it's in control, but it isn't, is it?" John's eyes followed her, and for a moment, she swore she saw a flicker of approval in his gaze. "Control is an illusion," he said. "The Empire's strength is built on fear, and fear is always temporary. It wears away, cracks open, and then the truth slips through." "You're talking about rebellion," Vastra shot back. "But that ended years ago. The Empire is in power now. You're wasting your time, Hargrove." John shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. The rebellion was just the beginning. What's coming now is different, bigger, and when it hits, the Empire won't even know what hit it." Vastra stopped pacing, her breath quickening. "And you're the key, aren't you? You're the one who knows how to bring it down." "I've learned a few things in my time," John said quietly. "But it's not me you should be worried about. It's the ones who are still out there, waiting. They've been waiting for the right moment. And that moment is almost here." A chill ran down Vastra's spine. For the first time, she felt the weight of what he was saying. There was truth in his words, something raw and undeniable. The Empire had become complacent, thinking its rule was unshakable. But John Hargrove's presence, his knowledge, had shattered that illusion. You're telling me the Empire is about to face something worse than the rebellion? Vastra asked, her voice hoarse. John smiled, a knowing, dangerous smile. The Empire is about to learn just how fragile its power really is. Vastra's mind raced. She had always believed in the Empire, in its power and invincibility. But now, she was starting to wonder if it was all built on lies. The rebellion might have been crushed, but what if something worse was coming? For the first time, she began to fear what would happen when the Empire's empire of lies finally crumbled under its own weight. And for the first time, she understood that John Hargrove, this old mechanic, wasn't just a prisoner. He was a harbinger of the storm to come.